Hello and welcome to The Print. I'm Snehesh Alex Philip. Well, I have with me my colleague Pia Krishnankutty, who covers the foreign policy for us. And as you know, seeing her, you would have imagined that we are discussing something which is related to foreign policy. What is intriguing is Prime Minister Narendra Modi's last week visit to both UAE and Qatar. And why I say it is intriguing is because Modi and the Arab world are the closest that India has ever been till now. One would have, I'll be the devil's advocate here, or I'll be the devil in the room when I say this. When Modi took over in 2014, no one really expected this kind of relationship with the Arab world, the Islamic world. But Modi has gone ahead and beaten all odds. And we are here to find out why. So Pia, welcome to the show once again.
Thanks.
What were these two visits? Why were these two visits so important, UAE as well as Qatar?
Well, for one, let's start with UAE. This would be Modi's 7th visit to the country, and in a first, he inaugurated the first mandir, the first temple in the UAE in Abu Dhabi. And following that, he also visited Qatar just shortly after the release of 7 out of 8 Indian naval veterans that had been detained in the country and had actually previously faced death sentences on alleged espionage charges. So this was seen also as perhaps a thank you to the Qatar Amir, who has been assumed to have pardoned these naval veterans. So that is why these two visits were so key and also created a lot of flutter. I mean, a lot of newspapers in India and outside published several editorials and opinion pieces. Analysts came out saying this has sort of been a historic engagement between India and the Arab world. Many years after the UPA government had some issues with this region, there was always the hyphenation with Pakistan and how the Arab world sort of treated its Islamic brother. But that sort
Kashmir was also a
Kashmir
point
was
which
an
came
issue.
out, yeah.
But that seems to have also been overcome. And these two visits are seen as sort of a symbolic victory over some of those previous questions.
Well, you mentioned apparently pardoned. Of course, they have been pardoned, and that's the reason why those 7 of the 8 naval veterans are back home. One is there is some travel restrictions on the 8th one, and she'll be tracking when they will be back. So you will get to read that on the print. But this pardon itself is a big thing. Forget the fact that they were naval veterans. For Qatar, these are 8 Indians who were accused of spying. And they've managed to, and Qatar has gone ahead and pardoned them. They brought back. It's unprecedented in a way. Usually one would have expected that they would serve the remaining jail sentence here. Something of that kind of arrangement would be there, but they are here. How did that happen?
It's, well, according to the Indian government, right after these veterans came back, their release was mainly due to the Prime Minister's personal supervision over the case. That's a line that's been constantly reiterated by the Ministry of External Affairs. And interestingly, the Foreign Secretary held a briefing after their release last week saying, the PM never shied away from any initiative that would have guaranteed their release. Now, for journalists like me who've been covering the beat, that instantly made us think of a massive LNG deal that was signed between Qatar and India.
$78 billion.
$78 billion, a 20-year contract, which some say was anyways going to be renewed.
Yeah.
But the timing of that deal was also quite curious. It happened just a week before these naval veterans were released. So that's your answer, the PM's personal supervision, and also it could be that certain initiatives were taken also in the back.
You rightly mentioned, a lot of experts that I speak to, mention about, underline the fact, as the Foreign Secretary underlined, is Modi's ability to strike one-to-one relationship with global leaders, But then there are also others who are more pragmatic, while I'm not undermining his capability to strike one-to-one relationships, and that's important. They would also say that this convergence between India and the Arab world also comes at a time when the Arab world itself is seeing a lot of changes.
Definitely.
In terms of how they perceive the global economy to be, or how they perceive their own economy for that matter, and how they perceive the political strategic at play. What would you say to that?
That's definitely been a factor. Just before I talk about the economic reforms, I'll mention a bit, even when the Saudi Crown Prince, MBS, introduced Vision 2030, which was his vision for the kingdom going forward. He announced this in 2018, I think. He talked about wanting to transform the Saudi state-owned oil giant, Aramco, into a global conglomerate. So, that is in keeping with a lot of GCC countries who have long understood that once the depletion of their oil reserves comes around the corner, they need to have a sort of contingent plan. They need to invest in emerging sectors like AI, digital transformation, green investments, so that they can get their returns on that for the next 50, 60 years. And a country like India is definitely an attractive partner in this sense because it's, it has robust economic growth right now. It's a large market, huge population. Already there is an 8.5 million strong Indian diaspora across this region in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, UAE. And leveraging that diaspora can also create great returns for countries like Saudi Arabia. So, moderate Islam is also something that MBS spoke about, but let's not get into that specifically. I think what's more interesting is, or more relevant to this discussion, is the fact that these are countries with some of the largest sovereign wealth funds. They want to invest in and partner up with countries that can give them ROIs, robust ROIs.
So that is ROIs would be return on investments. But you mentioned about the economic part of it. Yes, the economy part plays a significant role, I must say. But also the fact that you mentioned that MBS is now talking about the moderate Islam. You have the Abraham Accords. For example, you have the Saudis and the UAEs, establishing diplomatic relationship with Israel. Well, now it's seen a setback though, because of the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. But these are also very significant changes that is happening in the Arab world. So, does this also play a part in how they perceive India? Because, as you said, the India-Pakistan has been de-hyphenated now. It's been hyphenated for long, but now it's India is individually India, not connected to Pakistan, even for the Arab world.
You're right. But we also shouldn't forget it was just in 2022 that the whole Nupur Sharma controversy happened, where she's now been suspended, but she was a BJP spokesperson at the time. She made certain disparaging remarks about Prophet Muhammad, and that created a lot of backlash for India. And at that time, the Ministry of External Affairs, in fact, the entire Indian government machine was in quote-unquote damage control over this. Because as I mentioned, we had a huge diaspora in these countries. We are trying to bridge gaps, or we've been trying to bridge gaps with them, separate from Pakistan over the last few years. In fact, a critical sort of moment that a lot of experts say opened the doors between UAE and India was when the Indian Navy was allegedly played a role in sort of returning the Dubai princess who had fled from her country in 2018. And that was seen as sort of a moment of quote-unquote true intent that India was trying to communicate. So a lot of these rulers, a lot of these leaders in the Arab world, they see one-on-one relationships as key. They see a lot of trust that is built in the high-level quarters trickling down to the larger bilateral relationship. So a moment was that was also great to sort of increase the trust between India and UAE. And as far as Saudi Arabia goes, we had MBS visiting India just last year in September. He was given an entire official state visit, and a slew of deals were signed in digital payments, security, defense to a degree, and AI as well. So there's definitely a lot of intent, and I think Saudi Arabia is also, in the joint statement that was issued last September, had mentioned that India and Saudi Arabia are one of the only countries, large economies on the world stage, which are growing at a rapid pace at a time when Western countries are seeing such recessionary trends. They're bogged down by two major world wars on the global stage.
It's interesting that she mentioned this particular incident which involved the Dubai princess. Now, yeah, neither countries have ever spoken on it. There is no official record of such a deal, such a development having taken place.
There isn't, sorry to interrupt you, but the International Criminal
Yes.
Court in their case had mentioned India as playing a role in this
Yes,
case.
but as I said, both countries haven't ever commented
They've
on
not,
this.
yeah.
But the fact is that, as she said, this was one of the most significant aspect or the turning point when it comes to relationship. This happened in 2018.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, was a turning point where not India, but Narendra Modi showed that he meant business, and he's willing to take the extra step to reach out. So, in your sense, this is his ninth visit. Modi's ninth visit to UAE. Seventh visit to UAE. In your sense, do you see as UAE being the fulcrum around which Modi's Middle East policy really works, in the sense that is UAE playing a role in ensuring that Modi's outreach into the Middle East really works?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. I think when we think of the Gulf, instantly we think of our diaspora there. There's 3.5 million Indians in UAE. Maybe that is why. We've also signed an FTA with the UAE that happened in 8 months, which is quite a short time for a free trade agreement to be negotiated. But even following that, there have been a lot of huge investments from the UAE. But I would say Saudi Arabia is also a huge leader in the Arab world. We've been able to make inroads, especially with the Crown Prince, who is trying to, as I mentioned, modernize his country or transform his country into one that can adapt to changing economic headwinds. So I would not say that. I mean, I'm not particularly a domain expert when it comes to UAE. But I will say that there has been great strides made in the bilateral relationship with the UAE. The diaspora linkages have been leveraged. I think also UAE as a global trading hub, a lot of Indian goods go through Dubai for transshipment.
Yeah, the Dubai port.
So, like it is in Singapore, for example, for a lot of Western countries. So, it's strategically located as well, and it's a huge GCC player, which we've been able to make inroads with. I will say UAE and Saudi Arabia, interestingly, are the only two countries in the Arab world who have given civilian honors, the highest civilian honor to Modi. The UAE did it in 2016, and I think Saudi Arabia a little after that.
While we talk about, this discussion involves both UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar. The fact is that, there are other Islamic countries that India has, under Modi government, it has had excellent equations. For example, I think with Iran, we always had. But, under Modi government, we had to stop buying oil from Iran, So, while there was no business relationship, the relationship with Iran has also thrived, right?
I don't know if it's thrived, but it has definitely not declined as quickly as one would assume after we sort of abruptly halted oil imports in 2019 after pressure from the Trump administration. But there's still been a lot of intent from both sides. I think India's clever messaging on Gaza now, at first one would have assumed that, the messaging, the first tweet from Prime Minister Narendra Modi indicated that India is siding with Israel, but over time we've been able to balance our messaging. And
would you say we've been able to balance our messaging, or would
it's
we
adapted
say,
to the
or would we
situation.
say that people have now understood the nuance of it? Because right from the very beginning, I think the India's message was against terror, the Hamas attack, but at the same time India has been supportive of a two-state solution. They have India has not shied away from the two-state solution. I think even now at the Munich Security Conference, you had External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar stressing on the fact on two-state solution. So, but while of course you mention all that, one big factor that somehow seems to have disappeared from the whole thing is Kashmir. You have of course the OIC countries coming out with an annual statement, being critical of India, but I think the shrillness in their statement has also come down. Why is that so? Is Kashmir no longer that an important thing, or now that it is India, Pakistan has been de-hyphenated, it's no longer that an issue?
I don't know if it's just about looking at OIC statements. I think we've been able to see a lot of these countries in the Arab world put their money where their mouth is, you know. The UAE is invested in Jammu and Kashmir following the FTA.
Yeah.
They've invested in industrial food parks in Jammu and Kashmir, and this was after the Modi government scrapped special status there, much to Pakistan's displeasure. So I remember when that happened, I was covering the FTA, and there was a lot of news and flutter in Pakistan about this. You know, that an Islamic brother is investing in what they view as a disputed territory between the two countries. So those type of actions are very interesting and something we should pay attention to. I mean, Saudi Arabia wants to set up a sovereign wealth fund office in Gujarat, Modi's home state, to facilitate more investments in India. These kind of developments, I think, are more critical when we see how India's engagement with this region has evolved.
You know, now that we are aware of the fact that this relationship has really evolved, and it's thriving, in my sense, this relationship is thriving under Modi's government. But as a journalist, or forget as a journalist, as a citizen of the country, are you surprised by this? Because I'll admit, you know, I'm sure, you know, a lot of commentators will, you know, throw brickbats at me for saying this, but I was surprised. I continue to be surprised. I know that there's a pragmatism which has come into the relationship as far as the Middle East is concerned, the Arab is concerned. But are you surprised that Modi has managed to pull this off? Given, you know, the kind of the background that he had, you know, the attacks that have taken place on
the
him,
ideology of the ruling
the
government.
ideology, you know, the whole ideology thing. Modi has been insisting on sabka saath, sabka vikas, but then there's a whole there are a whole section which speak out against him and say that he's not doing that.
I wouldn't say, I mean, whether or not I'm surprised, I do think it has been a significant change that one cannot dispute. During Manmohan Singh's time, he only visited the region about 4 times, and that was mainly for non-aligned summits.
Yeah.
This time around, we're not just seeing the Prime Minister. I don't want to just talk about the PMO.
Jaishankar.
Yes, the Ministry of External Affairs, the NSA, Ajit Doval, has visited the region several times. In fact, Jaishankar's Minister of State, Muralidharan, has frequented the Gulf, I think, more than he has also in the last 2 to 3 years. Even when the Sudan war broke out, if you recall, it was Saudi Arabia that helped evacuate our Indian citizens.
Yeah.
And after that, Muralidharan made sort of these thank you visits by visiting them and expressing our thanks for that. But apart from that, I would also say the security establishment, the NSA, has been frequenting that region also because we are now part of US-led security architecture there. We are part of the IMEC, the India Middle East Economic Corridor. Of course, there are still technical questions over that. How is it going to be funded? How is it going to be developed right now with the Israel-Hamas war going on? But nonetheless, we are part of that project. We're also part of the I2U2 with Israel and the UAE. And I guess the reason why I'm not entirely surprised is because as we mentioned at the start of this discussion, the Arab world is changing.
Exactly.
This slow drift towards perhaps normalizing ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel is significant, and the US was mediating those talks. Now those talks have come to sort of a screeching halt with the Israel-Hamas war, which was evident in Saudi Arabia's statement on 7th February. The foreign ministry said that, you know, the Palestinian state is now a contingent, a necessary condition. Should we want to normalize relations with Israel. So yes, there have been lots of changes in the Arab world. Of course, our government has taken and leveraged certain aspects of bilateral relationships with countries there, diaspora, otherwise, and it's paying off.
It is paying off. So last question to you, Pia, where do you think this relationship is really going? You know, you have, of course, as you mentioned, other countries are on a decline economically. Not on a decline, if I say the growth has really stunted. India continues to grow. You know, where do you see this whole India, Arab, Middle East relationship going ahead?
I do see it, building as it goes forward, because the investments I mentioned, UAE investing $75 billion in India, Saudi Arabia $100 billion, these are going to mature. These are going to reap benefits going forward. That is what we should be watching, how these pledges of investments are going to revolutionize maybe even our economy and our relationship with that region. That is something to keep an eye on, to see how this relationship will keep growing and evolving. And also, we should also keep track of how the Arab world is going to balance China and the US.
No.
India might emerge as a middle power in that equation. And I think there's also appreciation for India's strategic autonomy vis-a-vis the US as well. Yes, we've been able to make strides in our relationship with the US, but we've also been, as I think Jaishankar mentioned in the Munich Security Conference, he said we're not anti-West, we're non-West.
Yeah.
I think that sort of thinking is also appreciated in the Arab world. So these things might play a great role in deepening our engagement going forward. And as I mentioned, keeping an eye on how those investments mature will be critical.
Absolutely, and we'll keep a close eye on that. But thank you so much, Pia, for joining in this discussion. And viewers, I hope you get a sense of how this relationship has really evolved, how there's a lot of pragmatism that has come into this relationship, how Modi's, besides of course Modi's, Prime Minister Modi's interpersonal skills and relationship building, the churns that are taking place in the Middle East and the economic opportunity that they see with India's economic rise also plays a critical part. But thank you so much for joining in and watching this discussion.